What if everything you thought you knew about Area 51 was just scratching the surface? What if the real secrets weren't in the hangars we've been obsessing over for decades, but buried deep beneath the Nevada desert, in a place so classified that even most government officials don't know it exists? I'm talking about Underground Base 7, and according to a former Area 51 director who just came forward, its true purpose is far stranger and more significant than anyone imagined. Before we dive into this rabbit hole that goes much deeper than you think, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is the kind of information that doesn't stay public for long. For years, conspiracy theorists and researchers have speculated about what really goes on beneath the surface at Area 51. We've all heard the stories about reverse-engineered alien spacecraft, captured extraterrestrial beings, and technology that would make our current understanding of physics look like kindergarten science. But according to Dr. Marcus Webb, who served as a senior director at the Groom Lake facility from 2003 to 2011, we've been looking at this all wrong in a series of interviews conducted over the past 6 months. Webb has painted a picture of Underground Base 7 that's both more mundane and more terrifying than the popular theories suggest. Underground Base 7, or UB7 as it's known among those with clearance, sits approximately 800 feet beneath the desert floor. That's deeper than most mining operations, deeper than subway systems, deep enough that conventional bunker-busting weapons couldn't touch it. And the base was constructed between 1978 and 1985, during a period when official records show only routine aircraft testing at Area 51. The construction itself was a masterpiece of secrecy. Thousands of tons of rock and soil were removed under the cover of darkness, transported away in vehicles that had no official registration, driven by workers who signed non-disclosure agreements, so binding that violation meant life imprisonment under national security statutes. But here's where it gets interesting. According to Webb, UB7 was never designed to house alien technology or extraterrestrial biological entities. Instead, its primary function was something far more grounded in human capability and far more unsettling when you really think about the implications. The base was built as a continuity of government facility, but not in the way you might expect. This wasn't just another bunker where politicians could hide during a nuclear war. UB7 was designed as a complete reconstruction hub, a place where the entire framework of American society could be rebuilt from scratch if surface civilization collapsed. Think about what that really means for a moment. We're not talking about storing some emergency supplies and communication equipment. Webb describes a facility that contains genetic samples of thousands of plant and animal species, seeds stored in conditions that could preserve them for centuries, and most controversially, a genetic database of human DNA samples from individuals selected for their diverse genetic traits and abilities. Well, this is essentially a Noah's Ark built not by divine command, but by Cold War paranoia and an understanding that humanity's destructive capability had finally outpaced its wisdom. The facility spans across 12 levels, each serving a specific function in this grand design for civilizational rebirth. The upper levels, closest to the surface, house the more conventional aspects: command and control centers, living quarters for the permanent staff who rotate through 6-month assignments, medical facilities equipped with technology that's reportedly 20 years ahead of what's available in civilian hospitals. But it's the lower levels where things get really strange, where the line between preparation and playing God becomes uncomfortably blurred. Level 7 is entirely dedicated to what Webb calls the genetic archive. Was imagine a library, but instead of books, you have millions of samples stored in cryogenic conditions. Every major food crop, every domesticated animal breed, samples from wild species that range from insects to large mammals. There are even samples from species that have gone extinct in the wild, but whose genetic material was preserved before they vanished. The stated purpose is noble enough, preserving biodiversity in case of global catastrophe. But Webb hints at something more. Research into genetic modification that could accelerate evolution, creating organisms better suited to survive in post-apocalyptic conditions. Level 8 contains what's called the Knowledge Vault. This is where humanity's accumulated learning has been stored in multiple formats, designed to outlast electromagnetic pulses, solar flares, and/or any other event that might wipe out digital storage. We're talking about physical books, microfilm, even stone tablets with essential information carved into them. Everything from basic agriculture to advanced physics, medical procedures to philosophical texts, all carefully curated by teams of experts who had to make impossible decisions about what knowledge was essential enough to preserve. But here's what really made my blood run cold when Webb described it. Level 9 is designated for what the documentation calls social engineering protocols. This level contains detailed plans for rebuilding not just the physical infrastructure of civilization, but its social structures as well. We're talking about predetermined governmental systems, economic models, even cultural narratives designed to shape the worldview of survivors. Webb struggled with this part of his revelation. You could see the moral weight of it bearing down on him, because what this really means is that some group of people with enormous power, has decided how human society should be structured if we ever have to start over. The question that keeps gnawing at me is who made these decisions? Who decided which crops to save, which animals to preserve, which books contained knowledge worth protecting, and most disturbingly, which social structures should define humanity's second chance? Webb indicates there's a committee, representatives from various government agencies, academics, military officials, even private sector individuals, whose identities remain classified. This shadow council has been meeting regularly since the 80s, updating the protocols, refining the plans. They were essentially holding the blueprint for human civilization in their hands. Level 10 is something Webb only discussed briefly, and his reluctance spoke volumes. It's called the contingency level, and it's where protocols exist for scenarios so catastrophic that even the other levels of UB7 might not be enough. He mentioned something called the reset option, a protocol that would only be activated if surface conditions became not just uninhabitable, but actively hostile to human life as we know it. He wouldn't elaborate on what this option entails, but the implication is chilling. Are we talking about genetic modification of humans themselves? Radical technological intervention? The creation of something that might survive, but might not quite be human anymore? Now, levels 11 and 12 are where Webb's account gets really controversial. And it's also where his information becomes more fragmented. He didn't have regular access to these deepest levels. They required clearances beyond even his considerable authority. But from conversations with colleagues and documents he glimpsed, he believes these levels are dedicated to what's euphemistically called origin research. And this is where the alien theories might actually have some basis in reality, though not in the way popular culture imagines. According to Webb, there's a faction within the deep state that believes humanity's best chance of survival in the long term isn't just preserving what we are, but understanding where we came from at the most fundamental level. Level 11 allegedly houses biological research that seeks to answer whether human DNA shows signs of ancient manipulation or intervention, and not in a mystical sense, but in a hard scientific examination of whether our evolutionary path shows anomalies that might suggest external influence. Whether you believe in ancient astronaut theories or not, the fact that serious scientists with unlimited black budget funding are investigating this possibility should tell you something. Level 12 remains almost completely mysterious even to Webb. He heard it referred to only as the archive, spoken about in hushed tones by the few individuals who had clearance to enter. One colleague who had been down there once told Webb it contained objects and materials that predated modern civilization by thousands of years, items that didn't fit into conventional historical narratives. Whether these are archaeological finds that have been classified to avoid disrupting established histories, or something more exotic, Webb couldn't say with certainty. The real question is why Webb is coming forward now, decades after the construction of UB7 and years after his tenure there ended. According to him, it's because the purpose of the facility is changing. What was designed as a contingency plan, a just-in-case insurance policy for humanity, is being activated in stages. Not because nuclear war is imminent, or because an asteroid is heading our way, but because the committee overseeing UB7 has determined that current trajectories, climate change, resource depletion, social fragmentation, make some level of civilizational collapse increasingly probable within the next 50 years. Webb describes increased activity at the base, expansions being undertaken, staff being increased, protocols being updated with greater urgency. Supply shipments that used to arrive quarterly are now coming monthly. Individuals with specific skill sets are being recruited, often without full knowledge of what they're being recruited for, placed in positions where they can be rapidly deployed to UB7 if necessary. There's a list, Webb claims, of people designated for preservation, individuals whose skills, genetics, or knowledge make them valuable enough to save when resources are limited. The ethical implications of this are staggering. We're talking about a secret program that's essentially writing off most of humanity as expendable while preserving a chosen few. The criteria for who gets selected aren't public, aren't subject to democratic oversight, aren't even acknowledged to exist. Webb himself struggled with this during his time there. He followed orders and maintained security, did his job, but the weight of participating in a system that had already decided most people weren't worth saving eventually became unbearable. What makes Webb's testimony particularly credible is what he's not saying. He's not claiming to have seen alien bodies or crashed spacecraft. He's not describing impossible physics or technology that violates known science. Everything he describes, while disturbing, is technically feasible with existing technology and enough money. And money is something black budgets have in abundance. The US defense budget contains trillions of dollars that go to programs so classified that even congressional oversight committees get only the vaguest briefings. Independent researchers have tried to verify Webb's claims. Our satellite imagery of the Area 51 region does show anomalies consistent with underground construction, unusual heat signatures that suggest ventilation systems for deep facilities, and power consumption levels that exceed what surface operations would require. Former contractors who worked in the area have come forward anonymously, corroborating that major underground construction occurred during the time frame Webb mentioned, though they weren't privy to the purpose of what they were building. The government's response to Webb's revelations has been predictably non-existent in official channels. No confirmation, no denial, just silence. but Webb reports being contacted by government attorneys threatening prosecution under the Espionage Act if he reveals certain specific details. Interestingly, these threats came only after his initial interviews, suggesting that the general outline of what he's revealed isn't what concerns them most. It's the specific technical details, the names of committee members, the exact location of access points. These are the things that trigger legal threats. What does this mean for the average person? If Webb is correct, it means that while we're arguing about politics and watching entertainment and living our daily lives, there's a parallel structure already in place, designed for a future most of us won't be part of. It means that some of the brightest minds and most advanced technology aren't being used to prevent catastrophe, but to prepare for it, which raises the uncomfortable question of whether those in power have already given up on saving current civilization and are focused only on controlling what comes after. Some researchers have suggested that UB7 isn't unique, that similar facilities exist around the world, perhaps even through international cooperation that transcends the usual geopolitical divisions. If catastrophe is inevitable, national borders become somewhat irrelevant. What matters is preserving enough of humanity's knowledge and genetic diversity to ensure something survives. Webb has hinted that he's aware of at least 3 other facilities of similar scope, though he won't specify their locations or which nations operate them. The technology housed in UB7 is apparently remarkable, and Webb describes artificial intelligence systems designed to operate autonomously for decades if necessary, managing the facility's systems, even making decisions about resource allocation and protocol implementation if human overseers aren't available. These AIs are reportedly trained on the entirety of human history, programmed to optimize for long-term species survival rather than individual rights or freedoms. That's a terrifying thought if you really sit with it, that our future might be guided by machines programmed with values we never consented to. There's also the question of what triggers activation. What event or series of events would cause the doors of UB7 to seal and the preserved chosen to retreat underground while the rest of us face whatever catastrophe unfolds above? And Webb suggests the triggers are more complex than a single nuclear launch or natural disaster. Instead, there's a scoring system that evaluates multiple factors: resource availability, social stability indicators, environmental conditions, even things like disease outbreak patterns and technological disruption. When the combined score crosses a certain threshold, activation protocols begin. This means somewhere, right now, people are monitoring these indicators, watching scores change, preparing for a decision that would effectively write off surface civilization. Webb claims the score has been rising steadily for the past decade, not yet at critical levels, but trending in a concerning direction. Climate migration, creating resource conflicts, topsoil depletion threatening food security, freshwater scarcity increasing, and antibiotic resistance spreading, each of these shifts the calculation closer to the threshold. What can we do with this information? Webb's message isn't entirely fatalistic. He believes that public awareness of these contingency plans might actually spur the kind of collective action needed to make them unnecessary. If people understood that the trajectory we're on leads to a future where most of us are considered expendable by those with the power to prepare, maybe we'd demand better leadership, make different choices, prioritize long-term survival over short-term comfort. It's a slim hope, maybe, but it's the reason he's risking prosecution to speak out. The story of Underground Base 7 is ultimately about power and who gets to make decisions that affect all of humanity. It's about the dangerous allure of control and the temptation to play architect of the future rather than participant in the present. Whether every detail Webb has revealed is accurate or not, the broader truth is undeniable. There are programs operating beyond public knowledge, making preparations for futures both dark and strange, shaping possibilities in ways we're not consulted about. And maybe the most important question isn't whether UB7 exists exactly as described, but whether we're okay living in a world where such things are plausible, where the gap between what citizens know and what's being done in their name has grown so vast that the revelation of a secret underground arc barely seems surprising. That's the real revelation here, not that they've built facilities to survive the end of the world, but that we've created a system where such secrecy is accepted as normal and necessary. The implications of UB7 extend far beyond the facility itself and into how we should fundamentally reconsider our relationship with authority and information. When institutions operate in complete secrecy, designing futures without our input, they're not just making decisions about genetic preservation or technological advancement. They're making a statement about what they believe we deserve to know, and more importantly, what they believe we're incapable of handling. That's a form of control that goes deeper than any physical containment could ever reach. Webb spent years grappling with this contradiction. He was a believer in governmental structures, in national security, in the necessity of classified information. But his time at UB7 forced him to confront the possibility that there are limits to how much secrecy a democracy can withstand before it becomes something else entirely. A government that operates entirely beyond the sight of those it governs ceases to be a government in any meaningful sense and becomes instead a ruling class, insulated from consequence or accountability. The psychological toll on people who work in these environments is something that rarely gets discussed. Webb describes it as a particular kind of cognitive dissonance. Knowing things you can't share, holding responsibilities you can't explain, participating in decisions that could affect billions of people while being unable to discuss them with anyone outside a tiny circle. Over time, this creates a different worldview. You begin to see the general population not as fellow citizens, but as variables in equations, populations to be managed rather than people to be consulted. This isn't a judgment on Webb or others like him. They're operating within systems they didn't create, following rules established long before they arrived. But it illustrates how institutional secrecy creates psychological distance between those making decisions and those affected by them. When you never have to look in the eyes of the people your decisions impact, it becomes easier to make decisions that would horrify you if you had to face them directly. What's particularly unsettling is how normalized this has all become. We accept that there are things our government does that we'll never know about. We accept that our tax dollars fund programs we're not told about. Or we accept that decisions affecting the entire trajectory of human civilization are being made by unelected committees in underground bunkers. Perhaps acceptance is too strong a word. Resignation might be more accurate. Most people, when confronted with the reality of how much power and secrecy has accumulated in governmental and corporate structures, simply shrug and continue with their day because the alternative is a form of madness, a paranoia so complete it becomes paralyzing. But there's another way to look at what Webb is telling us. Perhaps the existence of UB7, if it exists as described, isn't primarily evidence of some sinister conspiracy, but rather evidence of something more subtle and more dangerous. And it's evidence that we've reached a point in human civilization where the complexity of systems has outpaced our ability to collectively govern them. We've become so dependent on institutional expertise, on technological infrastructure, on specialized knowledge that most people don't possess, that we've effectively ceded our agency to those who claim to understand these systems. The people designing protocols for post-collapse civilization might genuinely believe they're doing this for humanity's benefit. They might sincerely think that preservation of genetic diversity and human knowledge is a noble goal worth pursuing in secret. They might convince themselves that the information would cause panic if released, that the average person couldn't understand the technical details anyway, that security concerns outweigh any right to know. And these rationalizations exist on a spectrum from defensible to monstrous, but they're the constant refrain of every secretive system that's ever existed. Consider how this relates to other classified programs that have been revealed over the decades. The Manhattan Project worked in secret to create atomic weapons. MK Ultra conducted illegal experiments on unwilling subjects. The Tuskegee study watched men die of syphilis without treatment to observe disease progression. COINTELPRO surveilled and disrupted civil rights organizations. The secret bombing of Cambodia killed hundreds of thousands without public knowledge. Each of these was justified at the time by people in power who believed they were acting in the national interest or the interest of science. And each revealed a fundamental truth about what institutions do when operating without oversight. None of this means Webb is lying about UB7, though it's worth noting that we're essentially taking his word for it, combined with some circumstantial physical evidence and the silence of government officials. What it does mean is that even if every specific detail he's shared is accurate, the broader pattern is undeniable. Power concentrates, secrecy deepens, and the gap between what happens and what citizens are told grows wider with each passing year. The question of what we should do with this information is more complicated than it initially appears. Demanding transparency is reasonable, but has limited practical effect. Elected representatives can demand briefings, but as Webb notes, they get only vague outlines. And even Congress has limited oversight of the classified budget. Refusing to cooperate with classified systems is impractical for those whose livelihoods depend on government contracts. Public awareness campaigns might shift opinion, but shifting public opinion hasn't historically stopped governments from pursuing programs they deem essential to national security. Perhaps the more useful response is to fundamentally reconsider what kinds of institutions we want to build going forward. If we accept that catastrophic collapse is a real possibility, worth serious planning and resource allocation, then we should also insist that this planning happens transparently and democratically. If we're going to preserve seeds and knowledge and genetic material for a potential future, shouldn't that decision be made collectively? If we're going to decide who gets preserved and what social structures will govern the future, shouldn't those decisions emerge from broad consensus rather than secret committees? This is where Webb's optimism, however cautious, becomes relevant. He believes that consciousness of these systems is the first step toward changing them. People are less likely to accept secrecy and exclusion if they understand how extensively it's being practiced. They're more likely to demand participation in decisions that affect long-term civilization if they know such decisions are being made. They're more likely to invest in preventing collapse if they understand that current plans essentially assume collapse will happen and plan for who survives it. The history of human progress, if you look at it broadly, is the history of expanding circles of included participation. At various points, governments claimed that only certain groups had the capability to participate in governance, that the rest of the population couldn't be trusted with important decisions. Each time these restrictions were challenged and expanded, civilization didn't collapse. It adapted. Democratic participation became normalized. Education spread. Information became accessible. The institutions that claimed secrecy was necessary adapted to transparency. This doesn't mean transparency is costless or that all classified information should be public. There are genuine national security concerns, genuine reasons to protect certain technologies from hostile actors, genuine situations where information could cause harm if released too broadly. But the expansion of what falls into the category of classifiable information has far outpaced any legitimate security rationale. Conversations about policy choices, decisions about resource allocation, discussions of potential futures, these aren't security issues. They're governance issues, and governance in a democracy should ultimately be transparent to and accountable to the public. Webb's revelation about UB7 serves as a kind of mirror, reflecting back to us the kind of society we've created and accepted. It shows us a world where institutions have accumulated so much power and so much secrecy that they can plan for futures without consulting those who will inhabit them. It shows us the logical endpoint of accepting that some people need to know things others don't, that some decisions are too important for democratic processes, and that security sometimes requires abandoning principles. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that we have a choice about what kind of world we want to build next. Whether or not Underground Base 7 exists exactly as Webb describes, the conversation it opens is vital. We need to talk about what information our institutions should be keeping secret, what decisions require public participation, what futures are worth planning for, and how we should plan for them together. We need to recognize that accepting secrecy for the sake of security, resilience, or any other justification eventually corrodes the very things we claim to be protecting. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of the most classified facilities ever to be revealed by someone on the inside. The work that goes into researching these stories, verifying claims, thinking through implications, that's only possible because people like you engage with this content, share it, discuss it, and hold institutions accountable by staying informed. Your attention to these stories matters, even if it might not feel that way. If you found this information compelling or disturbing or both, I really encourage you to hit that subscribe button. We're constantly uncovering stories that challenge official narratives and ask difficult questions about power and secrecy in the modern world. New videos come out regularly, each one diving deep into subjects that mainstream media either ignores or handles too cautiously. By subscribing, you make sure you don't miss any of these investigations as they happen. Turn on those notifications too if you haven't already. So the algorithms favor videos that get immediate engagement, so notifications help ensure you see our content right when it drops, rather than buried in your feed weeks later. And if you really connect with this work, leaving a comment below helps more than you might realize. Share your thoughts, your reactions, your questions, your own research. The community that builds around these conversations is just as important as the content itself. The story of Underground Base 7, of government programs operating beyond public knowledge, of futures being shaped without our input. These stories matter because they're about us and our world. They're about the kind of society we're accepting by default and the kind of society we could build if we insisted on participation and transparency. Thank you for caring enough to listen, to think critically, and to engage with information that challenges comfortable assumptions. That's where real change begins.